Welcome to the third session of our Virtual Production 201 series. In this video, we'll cover the hardware needed to operate an LED volume. I'm Katie Cole, Director of Product Marketing and Virtual Production Evangelist at Perforce, and I'm a member of the SEMPTE RIS for on-set virtual production. The goal of today's panel is to give anyone interested in setting up their first virtual production a good idea of what hardware they'll need and how to configure it for their shoot, as well as provide some information to help you have good constructive conversations with others that might be working on the project with you. Let's meet today's panel of experts. Tim, I'll start with you. Please tell our audience who you are, the company you represent, and the types of virtual production projects you've been involved with.
Sure. Thanks, Katie, for having us. My name is Tim. I'm the CEO of View Technologies. We're a network of virtual studios specializing in virtual production. And we work typically with short form, high-end commercial work, and had the fortune of working with brands like Sony, Disney, and Amazon. And so we're excited to see today how the virtual production industry continues to grow and the excitement around producing content this way.
Great. Jeroen?
Hi, I'm Jeroen Hallaert, Vice President Production Services at PRG. PRG is a global company, not only working in TV, film, but also in live music, Broadway, and corporate events. We've been doing virtual production, although not really under that name, for the last 10, 12 years, going back as far as the movies like Benjamin Button, and then a lot of David Fincher work all the way through right before the pandemic hit, movies like Joker, Irishman. And then during the pandemic, we slightly moved over virtual production into the music world. So a lot of the A-list artists have adapted to that as well.
Great. Well, thank you both for joining. So I'd like to begin our conversation today talking about some of the fundamentals. At the highest level, what types of hardware are needed to do an LED volume shoot, and what role do each of those pieces of hardware play in the production? Tim, would you mind describing some of those categories?
Yeah, sure. I think there's really 5 main categories that you look at. One of the most obvious ones is the LED panel. That's when people describe virtual production, a lot of times they're talking about a stage that has a large LED display into it, and that has its own features and components to it. But the LED panel itself, I think, is one of the biggest parts. The other one is the processor, what actually runs the data to that screen. And there's several different types of processors: Brompton, Novastar, Color Light, all do different things better, across the spectrum. And then there's the motion tracking, which allows the game engine to understand where the camera is in 3D space and make the virtual camera mimic that along the screen. And the fourth thing is the computer system itself. Oftentimes in a virtual production environment, you need several computers in a cluster in order to run the screen, because there's just a lot of pixels that you're driving. And so those computer clusters become a really important component. And the last part is the camera. And that really completes the whole feedback loop of being able to put a graphic on the screen, process it, have the camera tracker move with it, and then that camera recording that image as if it's appears to be photoreal in the background. So those 5 things really make up the whole virtual production process.
Yeah. And Jeroen, do you have anything to add? What are your thoughts on Tim's 5 categories?
I think Tim described very well the ecosystem that virtual production is, which is when you're in a fixed location, like we have some across North America and Europe. It is greatly described here. But there's not only fixed locations where you have a setup, there's also productions where you have to build a temporary setup. So when we're dealing with situations like that, we'd like to look at, and this is the way the company works, we build and take things out on a day-to-day basis. But you want to look at stage location, you want to look at the building, you want to look at floor capacity, how much weight can you put on the floor? Because if you have a ground supported LED wall, that adds significant point loads to the floor. If you want to hang your walls or any kind of ceiling pieces or additional light panels, and of course you need to look at the ceiling, what can the ceiling carry? Do we need to bring in a structure to support that, or is it the venue or the studio or the stage we're working on, is it actually sufficient to carry that? Then because we're building an enclosed, sometimes volume where you have a 270 or 180 degree volume with a roof or a ceiling in LED, you're enclosing that space and you have heat coming out of the LED panels and additional lights. So we want to look into HVAC, how you're going to keep temperature controlled. You also want to look at additional lighting, because although we are using LED ceiling and walls for lighting, sometimes hard light means you need to bring in additional light fixtures. So that itself, you need to look at all the scenes, how you can rig the lighting. Do we ground support it? Do we fly from the ceiling? And then fourth important point is when we are shooting in a volume in front of a wall and we're combining it with practical set pieces, which is typically the case, then obviously you want to make sure that the whole logistics around practical set is also looked at. Not only you have to bring it into the building, but you also have to bring it into a building within the building, because we're dealing with a small volume. So we've been looking lately at actually building big rotational platforms, so we can build multiple sets in one and the same volume and then use it as we need it and turn it around as we need it. So all these practical things I'd like to add to Tim's great breakdown of what the ecosystem of virtual production is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'd add to that too, you know, what we found, and I'm sure you've seen this as well, that you need a lot of electrical to run these type of systems. And so when you think about a standard panel might be between 100 watts to 300 watts, it doesn't sound like a lot, but then when you have 1,000 of those panels, now you're driving, you know, in excess of 300,000 watts. I mean, this is a serious, sometimes electrical nightmare depending on what location you're in. And so I've been at jobs before where they go to do a permanent install at a like warehouse location, and it's just not fitted for that kind of electrical. And so I know like with PRG that you guys have generators and like are able to like bring that mobile electric on site, and sometimes in fixed locations we have to actually, you know, call out and do a dig and bring in more electrical to just run the facility.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, that's a really great list and a good starting point for what is needed. But in conversations we've all previously had together, we discussed that there are many options available, and you even started to touch on some of them as you were going through the categories. And I'm not just meaning brands, but also different hardware that just functions in a totally different way, but still serves the same purpose. So when somebody is trying to figure out exactly what hardware they're going to need for their project, what are some of the kinds of questions they're going to need to answer, or to help figure out, like, what are they going to have to think about in order to figure out the best hardware to use for their project?
Well, I would say the first thing that you have to determine is what type of virtual production you're doing. And there's several different categories. You know, XR is a very popular way to do it. It's for live broadcast. You'll see a lot of XR solutions for virtual production. If you look at the way The Mandalorian did it, it's kind of like an ICVFX environment where you don't have an LED floor. It's more practical set, and they use a ceiling for ambient lighting. But then there's even virtual production where people are using motion capture, and so none of those. And so determining what type of LED you're going to use really starts with what application. In an XR setting, it's very important that you have fine pixel pitch, because you're going to have the person relatively close to the wall, and in many cases you'll have the wall in focus. And so in that type of environment, you want a pixel pitch that's maybe sub 2, you know, 1.9 or a 2.5, somewhere in that area. Whereas if you're in an ICVFX environment where the wall is much farther from you, it's at a much greater scale and likely to be out of focus, then your pixel pitch isn't as doesn't need to be as fine. And so that could be in the, you know, P2.9. And so I think that is a big driver, is figuring out what type of virtual production you're doing, and then how much LED you're seeing, and how fine that pixel pitch needs to be.
And how would somebody determine, you know, what kind of virtual production they're going to be doing, right? Those that XR, ICVX, I'm sorry, in-camera VFX. I can never do all the letters of that in a row. Or that motion capture, like, are there certain types of projects that lend themselves to one versus the other? I know you mentioned XR is used a lot for broadcast. Is in-camera VFX used for certain? Are there any rules of thumb of when you're going to be doing what kind of virtual production project you're going to be working on?
I think whether you're working on a commercial or anything in the broadcast world, or even in music or feature scripted, is to really look at the breakdown of that whole shoot, and then start looking at where does it make sense to have an LED in the background, an LED wall, whether it's a volume or just a wall, the size of it. But that's going to actually help you determine what shape and size you'll be needing. That's a good starting point. Tim and you briefly touched base on XR and in-camera VFX, ICVFX. When you're doing XR, you're doing essentially set extension. So that means your wall or volume is a lot smaller than when you're doing in-camera VFX, where everywhere you pan and look with the camera, you have the LED in front of you. So XR is a lot used in where they're bringing in additional elements, but they're bringing in front plates, for example, when they're bringing in virtual lights, while the bigger LED walls or volumes, that's where they're really using the LED wall to its full extent when it comes to environmental lighting. Tim also started talking about pixel pitch, something we've seen because we have a wide range of not only pixel pitches but also within brands. Pixel pitch, the distance between each pixel, is that indeed, as Tim was saying, is that the sub 3 millimeter is perfect for on camera. Anything higher, so the 5 to 10 millimeter, the large format pixels, they provide a higher luminescence, and we're going to touch base on that when we talk about lighting. But those are really used for reflections and lighting. But more pixels isn't always better. We found out that ultra fine pixel pitches, for example, the sub ones, they actually compromise performance. So typically when we have a coarser pitch panel used for lighting and all of that, but it's really, really important to consider that more pixels isn't always better. While a finer pixel panel will give you more flexibility when it comes to avoiding, for example, moire or any kind of other artifacts or problems, selecting finer pixel pitch panels actually also may require you to make some thermal and color gamut trade-offs. But that's something you need to bear in mind as well, because the closer your pixels and the smaller your pixels are packed together, you're going to have a lot of heat on the back of the panel, and that's going to also impact performance on camera.
So you bring up a really interesting point. We've talked about the LED panel and how critical this is going to be to any virtual production set. And it's also in discussions, one of the most expensive, if not the most expensive piece of setting up a stage. If you don't have a permanent stage that you're going to be renting out and you're going to be building this, it's going to take up a lot of the budget. So how does somebody determine what type of LED panel they're going to need, or is going to suit the needs of their organization over time if they're setting up some sort of permanent solution? What are some of the characteristics?
Well, I think one of the most important things is figuring out what do you value the most. If you're looking at color fidelity, it's going to be important to find a panel that has at least a P3 color space, and that's going to tell you how accurate the RGB channels are. But then if you're looking more for value in the sense of you're buying a lot of panels and color fidelity isn't as high, but you need to get, a ton of square meters of wall, then you're looking at the economic side of things of, okay, how much can I get for this? And then, one of the things that we just talked about too is like luminance. If you're looking for doing something that's representing daylight and you need a lot of brightness, then you're going to be looking for a different type of feature. So I would say, again, determining based on the script, if you're looking at color accuracy or the amount of nits the panel can do, or you just need a sheer volume of a wall because it's a bunch of wide shots in these virtual worlds, those are all gonna influence what brand or what type of LED you buy. But I would say, some of the three most common brands I've been seeing on virtual stages are the row panels, AODO, and Infrared. And you're starting to see a lot of other panels, though, becoming popularized, like planar. Now I've been seeing more and more of. We have a panel that we've been using specifically for our stages that we've designed of a lot of common parts that are in those. But Unilumin is another one that we're seeing a lot of people putting in their stages. So to me, it's less about the brand and it's more about looking at the spec sheet and saying, hey, does this hit the brightness I want? Is it the refresh rate I want? I mean, refresh rate's now becoming a big factor. People that want to shoot frame rates higher than 24p and 30p, they're going to need a faster refreshing panel. So it's all really depends on what you're doing, on what you'll need, but those are the common things that we evaluate.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, Jeroen, do you have specific recommendations on like, okay, we've done this type of, it's a commercial or a live band set, and for these things, we know that we're looking for XYZ characteristics of an LED panel?
Well, I would say what I've seen very common is on XR stages, the people tend to use a row panel because the color fidelity is so high that when they do the set extension, they're able to calibrate in the computer and the panel the same type of color space. So it's very easy to blend that. In the ICVFX environments, I've seen it much more diversified. People are using all different types of panels. And because of the distance they're shooting at and the amount of props and stage sets that are on stage, some of those things aren't as necessary. You're not piping it back through the computer and trying to calibrate. So most of the calibration is actually done between the camera and the processor. So I would say that RAW typically for XR, and then for ICVFX, it really runs the gamut.
Yeah. I'd like to add to that as well. Tim brought up some of the brands. Is that none of these products were originally designed to do this kind of job. So we're trying to back engineer it to make it work. And of course, when you have big shows like Mandalorian pushing a certain brand or a certain technology, then the adapters behind that, the people behind that will take over that. I think there's a lot of testing that still needs to be done. And there's going to be a wider range of brands and products available. One of the most important things I'm personally looking at when choosing an LED panel is I really look at the electronic design as well. An important factor is the scan-mux ratio. And that's really the ratio of driver chips to pixel lines on one panel. The lower is better, 5:1, 8:1, 11:1, that's all an ideal range. Once you go into the 16:1, 32:1, that really needs testing. But that also means that your panel price is going down because you basically have more electronics and better electronics, the lower that scan-mux ratio is. And then obviously the quality of the drivers as well. We're all going, we all have the preference for 14-bit versus more the 16-bit linear. So that's where you see the distinctions between the lower spec panels, which cost less, but perform also poorly on camera.
Yeah, and Jeroen brings up a really good point, is that there's particular components on a LED panel that are going to drive the performance for things. So for instance, that driver IC, if you physically have more driver ICs, the ratio of driver IC to pixels is going to be better, and your that scan rate is going to you have more flexibility on the camera side of what you're able to do shutter speed wise and still maintain sync. But the other things too is even how the parts are soldered. Some brands use a golden solder, others have aluminum. Some of the cheap brands do it in ways that it falls apart quickly, and so being able to understand across the line, if you have a common LED panel uses a surface mounted diode where the pixels are literally just soldered onto a circuit board, and then something called a shader goes over in between the pixel, and that gives that contrast, like the black between the pixels. Understanding all of those things are going to influence what you're looking for. And some of the larger manufacturers now seeing that virtual production is becoming an emerging area where they can sell their product, are even open to doing custom changes to that. Like for example, one of the things that's important to us is we want the shader to be as black as possible, because that means that it rejects light that you might have some ambient light coming from your key lights, but then it also, in the areas when it's off, the blacks appear similar to the blacks of the props and everything else on set. It's important that your colors of the set and the wall are similar. So we, on all of our stages, require that there's an ultra black max shader, and that's not necessarily like standard on all panels. A lot of them do have them now, but if your panel was made to be for traditionally like billboard or in an arena, they may not have had a very dark shader. And in some cases, some people don't even put shaders on the panel. So understanding those unique things, like Ron mentioned, driver IC is very important. And it's not something people really talk about on the front page of their LED, but you got to go in the specs and see like, all right, is this a macro block driver IC, or is this like a no name thing, or, do they really even care of what they're putting on there,
You brought up a great point: contrast and blackness in on the LED, which is exactly what obviously the camera wants to see. And that's why we really believe for a long time going forward is that between the 2 and 3 millimeter pixel pitch is probably ideal, because that's where you have enough blackness around every individual pixel for the camera to see the contrast. Once you have a more denser populated panel, so a lower pixel pitch, that's going to make it very hard for the camera to really distinguish LED with the blackness and to really develop enough contrast. I think that's an important point to bring up as well.
Yeah, I think you're right. Like, that's actually something we prioritized because we found that out the hard way. When we went to finer pixel pitch, you have so much reflective surface area because it's almost pixel on pixel. That black shader is the fill factor. That's the thing that actually gives you that rich black. So if you're, shooting a mirror versus shooting a black cloth, there's a difference in how it appears on camera. And that's, you're totally right on that.
Yeah.
You both brought up the camera and how important your camera is with what your LED or what your camera is going to be trying to accomplish on your virtual production with your LEDs. So let's talk about cameras. What kind of cameras or what kind of functionalities, features do cameras need to have? Do you need a special camera to do virtual production, or can you use anything?
I've seen the most important thing is the ability to control the shutter speed, because a lot of times when your LED is running in a certain refresh rate, you need the camera to be in sync with that in order for the effect to work. Otherwise, you're going to get some rolling lines. And so, a part of selecting a camera is how much fidelity do you have in the controls of some of those sync type settings, like the shutter speed, the frame rate, all of those things that would impact that. And so I've seen, and Jeroen, I mean, you could talk on this as well, but almost every professional camera gives you that ability. And so knowing how to manipulate it will help. But having a gen lock too is going to ensure that, because now you're essentially locking the sync of the wall and the processor and the computer to the sync of the camera, just to ensure that all of those, there's a global clock, everything is in sync.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Your gen lock ties your entire system together, from GPU to camera to LED. And you need to have gen lock in order to have a reliable workflow on set. Cameras typically fall in two categories, or two families, if you want to call it that, which is the global shutters and the rolling shutters. The rolling shutter just goes over it, and you have in artifacting, you have that linear effect if you're not syncing your shutter speed. But there are tools available, ShutterSync, for example, which retimes the LED's effective refresh rate to really align it with your rolling shutter camera exposure duration. While a global shutter just takes your whole picture as a whole. Ideally, you're working with global shutters is what we found out. Because otherwise, you're going to introduce visual artifacts from the LED where they are exposing at different periods of time, basically. So Genlock, again, super important. And it starts already with the GPUs. We can add Genlock cards into whatever you're driving the content from. AMD has a great solution with the S400 cards to really achieve Genlock between multiple graphic cards, as Tim was saying earlier. Once you start using multiple GPUs, and really to enable to be synced to that external housing, whatever that is coming from, whether it's coming from your video source or from your LED wall. And Tim brought up a few brands. All of these brands in LED processing have tools to establish that. They have tools, and they are developing tools as we're going forward to really help out on that. There is a difference between Genlock and ShutterSync. Genlock is really what ties it all together, while ShutterSync retimes the LED effective refresh rate. I think that's an important distinction to be made.
Mm-hmm.
And what about practical lighting? When does practical lighting need to be brought in, and what type of practical lighting do you see brought in on sets?
We typically always use some type of practical lighting because when you look at the lighting difference between an LED that it's RGB based, so it's just got a red, green, and blue diode to it, it's missing some of the spectrum that you would see in normal natural light. So when you use a airy sky panel, it does have the red, green, and blue, but it also has a white pixel on there. And that's more representative of like 5600 Kelvin that would show you the full spectrum. So if you're lighting skin with your LED wall, you can do that, but it's not going to look as good as if you light with a practical light. So I would say the biggest priority on our stages when we use practical light is to make sure that skin tones and the color of people on set look good. But like Jeroen mentioned earlier, there's times where we gotta represent the sun, and the LED is a good soft ambient source, but it's never gonna produce the hard light that the sun would, in typical setting. And so we typically bring in stage lights for that have a much sharper edge to them. And so those are the two times that we see. And to be honest, I actually find, just as an artist, using lights as part of the set pieces a really good way to fake the illusion of virtual production, because when you see a light against the virtual background too, it just adds that extra layer of realism. And so we often put in lamps and other things just to kind of give that representation as well.
Yeah, working with LED volumes or walls is basically all one big light. Your entire space becomes a big softbox. So understanding that and understanding where you need to bring in that warm light, to Tim's point, to add to the more colder RGB range of colors, that's really super important. We also talked briefly earlier about Unreal. That was a name that came up earlier. You can also work smarter. You can use the light cards, and the light card in Unreal is a 3D object rendered in the Unreal space that acts as a light source or a little flag within the volumetric stage. So essentially, you're taking a small cluster or a small block of panels or a part of a panel and just turning them into basically an off-camera light or shadow source. So that's something that can be done in the gaming engine. So that's how you can work smarter around set without having to constantly bring in grips and lighting to do that. Mm-hmm. But Tim brought up a very good point as well. You want to have that hard lighting, that hard source, and really punchy light, which can be achieved sometimes with the lower res LED panels, if you really want to have that same kind of output and that same information. Or we're using, what we're using a lot is RGB show lights, that are used on live concerts, are used in theater. LED driven as well, where we send out a specific light information from the content and really drive that up into the rig and have that punchy lights. For example, Tim brought up the sun, but there's other things where you really want to have a hard light hitting an actor or a prop. And that's where DMX lighting is really a game changer. Mm-hmm. Because we can, in virtual production, you can have your traditional DMX system, which is used in live music, which is used on theater, for example. And you can really blend that with controls in Unreal, as I was mentioning earlier, or from where you're playing the content from. So that's a really going forward, using DMX lighting can really turn multicolor movie lights into effect lights for LED volumes.
And we've missed one big category, which is motion tracking. What about, okay, so when do you need motion tracking? And I know there are different types of motion tracking. So what type is best suited to what application?
Well, I'll start with the types. There's really two types of tracking. There's outside in, which is like a Vicon and a OptiTrack system. It almost looks like a bunch of security cameras around the outside looking in. Those are optical based systems, and they're looking in to figure out where the position of the camera is. And then there's inside out, which is when the processor and the emitter is actually on the camera, like a MOSIS or a Stipe or NCAM, and it's looking out to reference points like markers. It's common that you'll see that in a fixed studio environment. People put up what's called a star constellation, which is just a randomized pattern of markers. And now that processor is essentially triangulating its position in space using those markers. So in both of those scenarios, the outcome is the same, as you're just trying to figure out where is that object relative to the area. But the two major differences is that a inside out tracking system is an absolute base system, meaning that the stars that are stuck on the ceiling, those markers, they don't change there unless you're having an earthquake. That's going to stay exactly where it's at. In a outside in, it's a relative based system, and so it requires some calibration. Oftentimes it's a higher fidelity system, but you're constantly having to calibrate the new object you bring in to track, or how you're positioning that. And so it becomes, if you're figuring out what kind of tracking you're doing, it becomes a question of, do you prioritize fidelity, which is going to be at the cost of time and calibration, or is it about how quickly you can walk in and turn it on and it works? And so those are kind of the two main categories I see.
Yeah, and with any of the two, you brought up a good point with calibration. You do need to have enough time on the front end. When you start changing lenses on set, every single lens, whichever system you use, but every single lens has to be pre-calibrated in order for that quick changeover during a shoot. Spending enough time, and obviously as we progress, we're gonna be able to document a lot of the different lenses that are on the market, from the well-known ones all the way down to the obscure ones that only one DP has. But really calibrating the lenses and making sure we can switch them on a quick time around is important, because you are kind of breaking the whole marriage of camera and tracking and lens when you undo one of the elements and then changing it with another. So in order to have a fluent shoot, that's super important.
And so is motion tracking necessary for every shoot?
Absolutely not. It all depends on what you want to be doing. Again, going back to my earlier answer about really understanding your breakdown of your script and what you're trying to achieve. When you're doing XR, the set extension, then that's a given. You need to have your camera tracked somehow. But when you're doing in-camera VFX, you want the frustum, which is a geometric term. It's basically a pyramid on its side, where the top of the pyramid is your camera sensor, and the base of the pyramid is what is being displayed on the LED screen. So sometimes you want to have that frustum follow as the camera moves around in set. So that's where you need tracking. But sometimes you're far enough where you're just using the LED as a background, where you don't really need the actual tracking. It really all depends on what are the requirements of what you're trying to achieve.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's a good point. I mean, I think when you look at relative scale, if you're far enough from the background and there's enough props and things to do the illusion of parallax, you don't necessarily need that. Like, there's a lot of times we do landscapes that, if you imagine looking at a landscape and walking left and right 10 to 15 feet, that landscape's not going to really parallax that much. It's just going to slightly move. And so you'll essentially get that same effect because you're moving in relation to the LED screen. So we see it often with car processing, most of the car processing we've done, we don't go into Unreal Engine because it's easier just to have a plate of an actual street going by that someone recorded and put it on the screen, and that looks very convincing in camera. So there's things that we determine a lot of times that the client would say, okay, let's build this in a 3D engine and we'll use all this, and we start peeling back the tech and we say, hey, could we just do this with a photo? Would this make more sense with a video plate? And I'm of the mindset, like, if you can do it easier and it looks just as good or convincing, do it that way, because there's no need for anyone to work any harder at this stuff. It's all already very complex.
Exactly.
Like what Jeroen said about the lighting is, you have so much control, like with that DMX lighting and pixel mapping and all that you can do. But then it comes down to like, all right, do you have someone that knows how to do that? Because that's a complex thing. You really have to come from that like live show background or theater background to understand how to do that system and then connect it to an already complicated game engine system. A lot of prep that goes into this. Yeah,
that's fascinating. So we are nearing the end of our time together, and I'd like to get some final thoughts from each of you. What is the most important lesson you have learned when dealing with hardware on a virtual production shoot? And Jeroen, I'm gonna start with you on this one.
Okay. 2 different words: test, prep. There are so many variations in LED panels, so many variations in content, so many variations in cameras. There is no one solution that fits all. Just forget about it. This is how you have to do it. So understanding that and really testing put up a few panels before you build your big wall. Use your camera you want to shoot with. Try to get some lenses together you want to shoot with, and then maybe get some content that is close to what you're trying to do, and really test out that ecosystem we've been discussing the past 45 minutes. So while prepping is a given for almost every shoot, the undeniable amount of control you really have available on set to yourself and obviously everybody else involved, all the way down to the creative team, it's an untapped well of potential. Understanding that will give you all of the tools you want. You're giving back the tools that you typically only have in post, but you're bringing it back on set, which is great for people, but it also is a danger because you're giving so many tricks and toys and tools. And to Tim's point earlier, you really need to fully understand what that all can do for you. So although the rules are not really set in stone and maybe never will, as with any good magic trick, I always say the right amount of flair in the setup can really help you sell or solve almost everything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would agree with that too. There's so much that can be solved in the prep. And for me, really understanding the context, going in, knowing what you need, and doing some research on that is really going to solve a lot of problems on the front end. And so, there's no need to build a bazooka to shoot a squirrel. You don't want to build something that is overly unnecessary for the job you're doing if there's a simpler way to do it. And so I think understanding and learning, just like even through this series today, what is the right type of hardware for you is just really going to help the job become even smoother.
And make no mistake, you won't capture every shot in camera. There's a perception that an LED volume or an LED wall means that you're going to get final imagery in camera. That's not true. It can be true for many shots, but it's not true for every last one. Don't think of it as a zero-sum game. More as a continuum of potential additional finessing in post versus all or nothing. That there's a balance to be found between the two, and it does mean one of the things I always see people coming in is that the only constant in virtual production is change, because it's going so fast. We're getting hit by different technology, both on the hardware and the software side, on a day-by-day basis. And although some changes can be minor, like a new helper app or a faster lens, other changes can have massive ripple effects, just like we had in the past, like the invention of sound for picture. That was a big one. Optical compositing, CGI animation, digital cinema. There's all these evolutions in the past now we're seeing that over a much shorter time frame or time course.
Yeah, and I'd add to that too, that, one of the things I think is most flattering about virtual production is if you do a really good job, nobody knows that you did it that way. And so I think that's the goal, is make it so realistic that it's invisible. And if you can do that, then I think virtual production's really done its job.
Magic.
Yes.
And we'll end it on that magical note. That is really all we have time for today. And as always, I'd love to thank our panelists for sharing your expertise. And I would like to thank all of you who listened to this panel. The future of virtual production is bright and game-changing, but only because of the amazing content that you all are going to create. So thank you for watching, and we really appreciate your time.
Thanks, Katie.